Hey everyone, welcome to the very last event of the 2020 edition of FOLD Kids Bookfest. I'm very excited to welcome you all to Getting Real with Adam Garnet. We're going to introduce Adam in just a few short minutes, but first I want to give a bit of information about who I am and some of the context for this event. So first things first, who am I? My name is Hayley. I'm a queer, two-spirit, and mixed-race Anishinaabe Kwe with roots from the shores of Georgian Bay, England, and Germany. I currently live in Gitchin and Wikwudong, which is in Owen Sound, and I work at Lgbt Youthline as the manager of provincial engagement. So now feels like a good time just to plug a bit of info about Youthline. So Lgbt Youthline is a provincial organization that is led by 2S LGBTQ youth for 2S LGBTQ youth. We are a small but mighty team. Most folks know us by our peer support helpline. So 2S LGBTQ youth 29 and under can text, email, or IM to chat with a trained peer support volunteer who are also queer, trans, two-spirit youth 29 and under. So just a heads up that our service lines are open right now until 9:30. So if you need to reach out, please go to our website, youthline.ca, to find more information. Also, to add some exciting news about Youthline, we also offer different leadership programs throughout the province, and I'm very excited to announce that we're starting up a program that is in Peel and Halton, specifically just for Peel Halton, called Youth Organize, which brings together 2S LGBTQ youth to organize around issues coming up in your community. So check out our website for more details. The deadline is supposed to be tonight, but we will be extending, and you folks are the first to hear that, so announcement to come soon. So before I hand it over to my wonderful co-facilitator, Anu, I want to provide a bit of context about today, October 4th. So for those of you who don't know, October 4th is Sisters in Spirit. So today we mourn the thousands of Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit people across Turtle Island who have been murdered or who are missing as a result of the ongoing colonization of this land. Missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit people in Canada is in fact a genocide, and that the establishment of man camps in First Nations territory for the construction of pipelines, housing developments, mining, deforestation, among other acts of resource extraction, is a key factor in perpetuating the genocide of Indigenous women, girls, trans, and two-spirit people in so-called Canada. I encourage everyone here to read through the report, Violence on the Land, Violence on Our Bodies by Native Youth Sexual Health Network and Women's Earth Alliance to learn more. It's available for free in a PDF format online. And just a shout out to all my Indigenous kin holding down the front lines, protecting our territories throughout Turtle Island, ensuring that our children and all children and the next 7 generations have a future, and that the reality of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit people is no more. So I'd like everyone to keep Sisters in Spirit in your minds and thoughts as we move through this talk with Adam, and always. So right before I hand it over, so just some logistics for tonight. So tonight's event will be recorded. So if you're a teacher watching this, check back this week for the recording. Also, I'd like to provide a content warning. So just wanted to give folks the heads up that the content we're going to be talking through can be very heavy. We're going to be talking about suicide, self-harm, homophobia, sexual violence, state violence, missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit, and other content within the context of settler colonialism. So take care of yourself and your communities in ways that make sense for you. This can include taking a break from this chat, getting a drink of water, smudging, grounding yourself with your bare feet in the ground, as Shane does, or reaching out to our peer support line. Do whatever makes sense for you. And lastly, to all the 2S LGBTQ plus Indigenous youth watching this, thank you for being here. You're loved, you're seen, and I'm happy you're here. And now I'm excited to pass it over to my co-facilitator, Anu.
Thanks, Hayley. So my name's Radha Verma. You can call me Anu or ARV, and my pronouns are she and her. I live in Mississauga on the Treaty and Traditional Territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This is Treaty 13 territory, land that has been cared for historically since time immemorial by the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Chippewa peoples. As someone who identifies as a queer diasporic person, I think a lot about my responsibility in challenging the complicity that many immigrant families and people descended from immigrants have in settler colonialism. So I'm really humbled and honored to be able to share this moderating space with Hayley and to be sharing space with Adam tonight. Thank you to the FOLD for giving us this opportunity. I live in Mississauga in the suburbs, which I think are a place of brilliance, and I'm really grateful that the FOLD is actually happening here and online. If you're in the suburbs somewhere else, thank you for tuning in. And I want to say a little bit about some organizing that I do here, which has been supported by the LGBT Youthline and Hayley in particular. So I organized with a group called QTBIPOC Sauga, which is queer and trans, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. It's a grassroots gathering of QTBIPOC people from across Peel. We started in January of 2016, and it's actually the executive director of the LGBT Youthline, Burqa Gupta, and I, who, after feeling frustrated about a lack of space for QTBIPOC people here in the suburbs, said, we'll just kind of do a meetup and see what happens. And worst comes to worst, we'll just hang out in a coffee shop together once a month. We've been going strong for 4.5 years, and we still are the only space dedicated to QTBIPOC folks in this way. I guess I want to say also that there's some complexity in thinking about what this book means. Sorry that it's backwards, and how much we don't talk about the challenges that QTBIPOC people face in the suburbs. And so we're going to be holding space for this complex and difficult at times conversation. And I'm really glad that the LGBT Youthline is open and available. If you want to connect with someone who's in the suburbs, if you happen to be here in Peel, you can get in touch with QTBIPOC Sauga. We're on Facebook, Instagram. We have a website. You can email us at qtbipocsaga@gmail.com, or you can also send a text. We're not a support line. It's really just a grassroots space, but you can also get in touch by WhatsApp, text, and phone call if you're one of those people who uses the phone at 416-993-4221, which is literally this phone right here. I want to say thank you so much again for joining us today, Adam. So Adam Garnet Jones is a Cree Métis author, filmmaker, and beadworker from Edmonton, Alberta. His first book, this beautiful one here, FIRESONG, is based on his award-winning feature film. He currently works as the lead of Indigenous initiatives at Telefilm Canada and the Canadian Media Fund. Welcome, Adam.
Thanks so much for having me. That was an awesome start to the talk. Thanks so much.
So Hayley and I are going to be taking some turns asking Adam some questions, and we're also going to be accepting questions from folks who are joining us if you want to use the little question and answer box. No pressure. It can be stressful to think of questions on the spot. So we'll start the conversation off and then you can chime in. And I'm going to pass it to Hayley to start us off with the questions.
Awesome, thanks folks. So for our first question, we want to talk about moving to the city and the themes that were coming up for Shane in relation to moving to the city. So for so many to us LGBTQ plus youth, including Shane, Toronto has become the pinnacle of freedom, choices, acceptance, and for many, survival. So throughout the story, there's a continuous narrative of Shane wanting to move to Toronto where things will quote unquote be better, as in he can be with his partner, be free in his queer identity, and have access to post-secondary education. But in the end, he decides to stay in his home community. So our question for you is, why did you choose to end the story in this way? And what is the significance of telling the story in this way?
Yeah, there's a lot in there. So I think maybe first I'll say, so the book came second. I wrote the screenplay and made it as my first feature film initially. And so for me, the idea of Shane really seeing the city as a bit of a fantasy and an escape and a place where he could be himself was something that was always part of the story. And the idea of that fantasy of escape being something that really kept him going through tough times. That's something that certainly felt true for my experience as a young person, really focusing on like getting away from the place where I was, and that like the place where I was then wasn't my real life, and my real life was going to start sometime later and somewhere else. And that was when I would really feel good and feel safe and feel protected and find my community and all of that stuff. And then when, as in real life, I did move from Toronto or to Toronto. And I feel like I'd never been as sad as I was when I looked for community in, first in Vancouver and then in Toronto. Because I realized that fantasy wasn't really there, and that all of those issues that I had growing up were still really part of my life and part of me. And so that moving to this new place, there was different opportunity, there was maybe different levels of acceptance and opportunities for me to explore my queerness and everything in a new way. um the city wasn't this freeing safe place. There are a lot of dangers in the city. And when I went to university, and then after school, I ended up working and running a place called Seventh Generation Image Makers, which is a youth, like an Indigenous youth art space in downtown Toronto that operates in conjunction with Native Child and Family Services. And so it's like a youth drop in, and there's lots of kids in care who are around. And when when I was working there, a lot of the youth that I was working with um, had the experience of coming to the city for opportunity, for escape in lots of ways. And seeing them come to the city and then come to Native Child and to the youth drop in and Seventh Gen. um, there were a lot of kids that were coming from situations that were different from mine, but that experience of like coming to the city and facing disappointment and danger and really wanting to find community and struggling to find it, and feeling like, oh, like that promise that the city holds isn't really there, um, was something that I kept seeing again and again, and it felt like it really echoed my own experience. So that to me was always like a really central part of the story. Um, and then also when I was thinking about um, queer narratives and narratives about Indigenous people and Indigenous communities, there's always um, conversations about like, well, why don't Native people just leave? Like, it's really bad on the res. Like, why don't they just leave the place where they came from and like move to the city and get a job and be normal or whatever? And um, so there's that story, but there's also the really popular escape story for queer people of life being really hard for queer people in the place where they come from, and they get pushed out by homophobia, and then they move to the city and they do find that acceptance and they do find their community, and it has a kind of a happy ending. And so in telling, in some ways, a version of that story, even though Firesong really isn't a coming out story exactly, um, I wanted to think about like what the honest version of that could look like. And when I was working with people on the script for the film, mostly, well, always non-Indigenous people were telling me that they really wanted to see Shane leave the community. They wanted to see him leave, and they wanted to see him go to school and be successful, and that would give them the feeling of catharsis or something at the end of the film. And I kept saying, it's not safe. After everything that he goes through in that story and the place that he is, he needs to explore his sexuality and his identity and all those kinds of things, but he also needs to be with his family, and he needs to grieve, and he needs to face all those things, and he needs to be supported and to play a role in his community and support other people. And so that's the place that I really wanted the book to get to, is like finding a place where that could be possible. Because to me, I mean, it's not like a happy ending, but like to me, that felt like an ending where there was some healing happening for Shane, and it felt like honest and true to what, um, I don't know, I guess in some ways, like the best possible scenario for somebody coming through that situation, to say like, all of these things, like he and his family go through, some of the worst things that a person can endure. And, they've managed to not lose track of one another and hold on to one another and support one another, in order to move forward. So I lost track of the question, but anyway, that's the that was the idea of the end, and why it was really important for me that he not, just go off to the city and have everything be okay, because it's just not, it's not real, it's not true.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, Hayley and I have had so many conversations about this narrative of Toronto as the promised land for to us LGBTQ youth in particular, and at not being. So I really, really appreciate that. Kind of thinking about this idea too of leaving your community or leaving your family. Like I remember being told by a roommate in high school, well, if your family doesn't accept you, like you should just kind of not necessarily you should disown them, but you should just cut them out of your life. And that makes me think about one of these conversations we're having a lot in QTBIPOC spaces here in Mississauga and Brampton, which are also places that are predominantly racialized, is a delicate balance of wanting to talk about the ways that homophobia, biphobia, transphobia exist in our communities, but not wanting to perpetuate these racist ideas that come from the mainstream. For example, these Islamophobic ideas that all Muslim communities are homophobic. And then thinking about the ways in which certain communities get labeled in that way and marked by white folks who are still controlling kind of dominant narratives of queerness too. So how do you think about this balance when kind of representing the complexities of either feeling or being welcomed on reserve within families, by elders in community?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's why stories are so important, you know, and why I wanted to write particularly the end of this book in a more complicated way, because as I said, we've kind of seen that story of people, you know, leaving their families behind and finding comfort and safety and excitement in the city. And I do think that there is maybe a bit of a generational divide there, and like in the first wave, certainly in the West, of um, queer people in the 20th century coming out to their families and building communities in a public way, um, that felt really radical and revelatory, that you could leave everything behind and you could build something new. You know, you can build your chosen family and create a space that's just for you and people like you. And I think that there's an incredible amount of power in that, and people have found you know support and power in that story for themselves, and been able to do that within their communities. But I think that what's interesting now is that you do see a lot of racialized queer and trans people saying, I'm not willing to do that. I shouldn't have to do that. I shouldn't have to leave my home. I shouldn't have to leave my family behind. Like, all of those people and those places are so important to me. And I want to build my own community, but I also want to have the community that I have, and have a place for myself there. And so stories where you see people wrestling with that and standing up for themselves and holding space, um, but also being generous with their families, you know, as their families struggle through that stuff. I think that all of those kinds of stories are really, really important and really valuable to take us to that next level, of acceptance and integration, and understanding of one another. Um, yeah.
Thanks, Adam. So for our next question, switch gears a little bit to just, I guess, another tough subject, but in relation to Destiny's suicide, so his sister's suicide. So throughout the story, Shane is working through his grief around his sister's death, and on a couple of occasions, he mentions pieces of knowledge that he knows in relation to missing and murdered Indigenous women, and questions if Destiny's life was stolen in a similar way. So can you tell us more about what this means and more about Shane's process around this?
Yeah. Um, it's hard because it's such a part of an integral part of the book. Um, and when I started thinking about the story and when I started writing, um, we didn't have the language around missing and murdered Indigenous women in the same way. Like, it just wasn't part of the public conversation. Um, but growing up, that this, all of these stories of the ways that our women have been taken from us is just so much a part of, um, it's just part of the air. It's just like you hear about, family and friends, and like I was living in the downtown east side when um, the women's bodies were found on the Picton farm, and it just, all of those kind of those echoes were just there, as part of my life, and it made sense to me that they would certainly be part of Shane's awareness of the world. And then when I was writing the book, it made sense to me because I was writing Shane as somebody uh, who's a teenager now, or at least a couple of years ago when I was writing. Um, it made sense to me that he would have some of that language and just be starting to think about it. Like, throughout the book, there's, Shane has some kind of political awareness of his place as a young Indigenous person, um, in the world, that where his family, um, his life, and the bodies of himself and his family and his friends, are kind of at the mercy of government, and used as a pawn in this ongoing, um, struggle that's been so much a part of our lives, and a part of Canada. Um, I'm just trying to like find my way through through this question. So it's there for Shane. He's thinking about it, and so it felt natural to me that he would think about his sister's death, not only as this personal loss, but start to think like, is this part of the pattern that I've been made aware of, that people are talking about? Like, um, is her death part of this ongoing political struggle? And in the book, you don't know very much um, about Destiny and what happened with her. So that question isn't ever really answered, but it just kind of hangs there for him. Um, and I guess I wanted that to be present in the book, um, as something of an unanswered question, because in all of these politics and all of these, individual personal stories that we all have, that we're all living, and all of these different political struggles that have happened over generations and generations, it's always, you know, the bodies of Indigenous women and the body of the land that, um, end up paying the price for everything. And um, I have some discomfort, I would say, with uh, some discomfort, I guess, with how that exists in the book, because I think that those things are present in the book, and I think that those questions are asked in the book, but I don't think, that the book does what it could to pull them apart. And maybe it's not the job of this story to do that. But in writing the book version of the film, and going back to Tara and thinking about Destiny, um, it was really important to me to write, to give Tara more of a voice, and to think more about what was happening for Tara, um, internally, and really work on her experience in the book. And so you have these chapters where, you get pieces of Tara's diary, and learn that she, was kind of discovering her voice as a writer, um, and yeah. So I found, I guess, some, um, I felt better about that in the book, but I do still. I mean, I'm sure you can hear in my voice that I still have that discomfort, that, like, I wish I could have done better for Tara, for Tara and for Destiny, because it's so important. Um, but I guess I wondered too about how you felt about. Can I ask you questions? How you felt about um, uh, those characters in the book and the way that that was dealt with.
Honestly, the reason I asked that question is because I actually found it really powerful that Shane did have, like, even though it was little tiny snippets around Destiny's death in relation to like um, how her death relates to missing and murdered Indigenous women. I thought that that was really powerful, and I think it makes a lot of sense connecting that back to the larger systems of violence that Indigenous folks experience at the hands of the Canadian
Hmm.
state. So kind of what you said around the language of like using Indigenous bodies as pawns and this ongoing colonial project that Canada participates in. I think that that was really powerful. And I know there was only a couple little lines about it, but like when I was thinking through questions for tonight, it really stood out to me. And I
Hmm.
really liked that um, that narrative was in there, and like of connecting her death to a larger power structure, because it is like, yes, of course it's her individual death, but yeah, it's like that's at the hands of the Canadian state. It's, to me, it's very much intentional that Indigenous youth are dying by suicide at such high rates. It's all part of like a much larger colonial agenda to make sure that Indigenous communities continue to be um, continue to exist in the way that we do today at the hands of the Canadian state. Yeah. So I found it really powerful. So that's kind of why I was asking that question, not because I don't think
Hmm.
that it was answered. For me, it was answered. And I like that he was questioning it. And it also made sense too, given like his age and just coming into those politics and like understanding those things. I think it made a lot of sense as to why he just started questioning it.
Hmm.
Yeah. So I really liked it. So I wanted to like thank you actually for including that in there, because I thought that those pieces were really powerful.
Oh, well, that's really great to hear. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, as I say, it's still, I think that as male identified people and artists just have to be really thoughtful about um, one, figuring out what our role is as supporters and how we can contribute to that conversation without taking it over, or without kind of sidelining it or pushing it away or giving ourselves the excuse that we don't have to think about it or talk about it, um, because it's not our bodies or we're not supposed to be a voice for that. So um, yeah, I think it's a hard thing to wrestle with, and yeah, should wish we did it more.
I kind of want to ask you a little bit more on this kind of question of
Sure.
writing through the suicide. One of the things I think about a lot is like who can feel that a future is possible, and this connects back to part of what Hayley's talking about. And this kind of moment that we get into when, for example, on social media, and there might be someone well known who dies by suicide, the language around suicide, committed, etc. And
Yeah.
all of that complex stuff. Who's at greater risk? Do you want to say a little bit about, and this is complicated too, because I think lots of queer people have their own experiences of suicidality, and we sometimes have a community language around it, or sometimes we have a lot of silence. But
Mhm.
just if you wanted to share anything about how you hold space for the complexities of writing about that grief and about that heartbreak. How did it feel for you? I know in other interviews you've talked about making that connection to some of your own experiences as a young person, and probably people who are watching that might resonate with them as well. Any reflections, Adam, that you wanted to share?
Yeah, I mean, uh, I've had, my own struggles with depression and suicidality, and that was a big uh, feature of my growing up, and of my life in an ongoing way, in a lot of ways. I mean, I think that the way that people talk about mental health and suicide is often in terms of uh, overcoming and finding healing, and then it being something that's kind of like, and then I outgrew it or got over it or whatever. And it's something that was a really powerful experience for me. And as I got older and moved to the city and met more Two-Spirit people, I realized that this incredibly private and profound and extremely difficult experience that I had had with suicide, um, in a similar way to what we're speaking about with missing and murdered Indigenous women, that wasn't just mine. That was something that I shared with a lot of people in my community, and that that is part of this kind of oppressive, intentional colonial structure that we're all living in and trying to find our way through. Um, and so that was a really important thing for me to realize, and that piece actually did weirdly help me to find community and commonality with other Indigenous youth and Two-Spirit youth in the city at a certain point in my life. But when I started to write the film and eventually the book, one of the very hardest things about it was um, to write about suicide in a way that I felt like could be responsible, because I don't want to lie. I didn't want to lie and have it feel solved for Shane, and I didn't want to lie and write about something that felt really cliche. And to be really honest, I wanted to write it for myself. In the kind of climactic scene in the book, to write about why we should stay, why we should stay in this world, why we need to kind of fight against this pull to the spirit world. And for me to find a a way to articulate that in the book and also to myself, was yeah, it was important to me, and a healing moment for me as well. Um, yeah.
Thank you. That was really important. Thank you.
So going off that theme of healing, I wanted to touch on intergenerational healing and ceremony. So I read and reread the final pages of the book so many times now, and it ended in such a powerful ceremony with so much like intergenerational love, healing, and acceptance. And for me, Shane and David's love being accepted by Evie and the ancestors spoke directly to the healing of the 4 individuals who were there together in that moment. But also for the community as a whole.
Mhm.
So for those who have already passed away, for those who are still there, and those yet to come. So for Two-Spirit and LGBTQ Indigenous youth, we've always been loved and accepted and celebrated within our communities, but settler colonialism changed this, but we're finding our way back. And I think the ending of the book was so powerful in that way. And I was talking to Anu earlier today, and I was like, I'm having a hard time framing a question about this. I just really just the end of the book was just so meaningful for me, and just wanted just to be able to talk with you about it. So just can you tell us a little bit about your thought process in the creation of this ending? What did you want to leave the youth with when they're reading this book, particularly the ending of the book, in terms of ceremony in their own way and being accepted, and knowing that the ancestors love them and that their elder in their community loves them, and yeah, it was just really powerful. So just wanted to know if you wanted to speak to the end of the book or to the end of the film, and yeah, what you were
Sure,
hoping
yeah.
folks would walk away with.
I think for a lot of non-Indigenous people who read the book, I think that there's a lot of content that is very specifically Indigenous, and kind of indigenizes queerness in a way. And I think that the end of the book kind of queers Indigenous experience a little bit. I think that, I mean, it's maybe not a universal experience, but I feel like that experience of like growing up as queer, trans, gender nonconforming in really anywhere, any family, but in this case, in an Indigenous family, it makes you question or want to push against rules and kind of roles that are given to us as as people, because we've been told so many times that we don't fit into one box or another, and at a certain point, I think a lot of us start to kind of love that we don't fit into one box or another. And so for the ending of the book, it was really important to me that um, you know, Shane and his mom not kind of take on the advice of a particular elder um, in the community to kind of like do ceremony in the way that it was supposed to happen. I really wanted it to be a moment where Shane and his mom come together and do create their own thing in the same way that that we're we're told, and we do create our own chosen families. I just really wanted this moment to be a choice that you have um, uh, Shane and his mom, and I'm forgetting. Oh, Evie. I just picture Mani in who's the elder in the movie. Um, Evie coming together and really just saying, okay, we're creating something that feels right to ourselves in this moment. We're kind of going by our own rules. We're not doing the thing that anyone has really told us that we're supposed to, but we're just having this moment to acknowledge what's happened, and acknowledge our love for one another and our commitment to one another as a family. And so that moment of like of ceremony that comes from the deepest part of them in a way that maybe they can't even articulate, just felt like a very um, it just felt true to those characters and felt very like very indigenous and very queer, all together. And so yeah, that's where that's where it came from, I guess.
Yeah, I love that as a community or as a family in that moment, they were able to find a way that made sense for them to honor the life of Destiny.
Mhm.
Yeah, I just really love that moment. So thanks for sharing that with us. So our final question that we had prepared, what is the main message you want to Spirit and LGBTQ plus Indigenous youth to take away from this story, or just a message in general that you want them to know?
um I think it's so hard to boil books down to messages. I mean, I guess the message that I would want people to take away is a feeling of freedom. That this story, no matter who you are, um, that this story can be your story, and that if you see something of yourself and your experience in it, then you can kind of claim the story, and you can take it and build on it and tell your own stories. Um, it's something that as indigenous people, there are so many stories that aren't told. There's so much richness in our communities and our cultures, and um, you know I know that this is a really tough story, and a lot of I've talked with a lot of people over the years about like, ugh, like why do we have to keep telling these stories of trauma? And I always think like, oh, I would love to write something that's a lot more fun, but it's just, I think that the truth is that a lot of us need to to work through this stuff and find that healing in order to get to some of the laughter that we have coming. Um, so yeah, but maybe that idea about freedom and resilience, and that you can you can build a life, you can make a life, and you can make that life in the city, and you can make it at home. Um, you have a right to that life, and you can find it, and you can build it, and you can make it, and it can look however you want it to look.
That's lovely. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you.
So I think that was all the questions that we had, but I am seeing, Anu, did you want to ask some of the questions that were in the chat?
Yeah, so we've got one here to ask about, so this is such an interesting thing to have the film first and then this beautiful book here. So a question around if the book stayed exact to the film or if you took any liberties in writing the novel.
So the book, I think the book is pretty close to the film. In writing the book, there were a number of scenes that Shane isn't in the film. And the book takes place almost entirely from Shane's point of view. So I had to write some scenes from the movie with Shane kind of involved in it in some way. So that was a little bit of a change. I think I've got a kid sneaking in. Hi. I know. We're gonna wrap up soon. We have story time coming, of course. And the other pieces that I spoke about was with Tara. Really working on building Tara's voice into the story. So I first wrote the book entirely differently. The first draft of the book had a whole bunch of different chapters from different characters' points of view, and the editor that I was working with kind of said it's a little convoluted for a YA novel, and maybe there's a way to make it feel a little bit more direct. And the suggestion was to pull out everyone except Shane. And I had a really strong reaction because I felt like I just wanted to do more for Tara, and I just kind of said, like, that's non-negotiable for me. Like, she has to have a strong voice in this book. In part because of the way that the film was told, and I really felt like that's something that could be grown and developed. So I think that's probably the biggest change to the book. That, and also just getting to be inside a character's brain. Writing screenplays, you're only really allowed to write what you can see and hear. So being able to write Shane's internal thoughts and to build in his past, and to build in all of his memories of his sister and his family, and to put more sexy stuff in there, and all that kind of stuff was a way that I felt like I was able to really build on the film.
Lovely, thank you. Yeah, I definitely appreciated the beautiful way that the sexy stuff came out. It was really lovely.
It was sexier, but it got edited.
Oh. What I would give for the Cree version.
Threshold. There's a threshold that I discovered.
That's a conversation for even later in the evening, I think.
Yes, perhaps. Yeah.
I think I'm going to ask Hayley, any follow-up questions that you had, Hayley?
No, I don't think so. This conversation was great. Thanks so much, Adam, for giving us the opportunity to chat with you and to the Fold. Yeah.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for reading the book closely and having such great questions about it. I really appreciate it.
I want to thank you all for all the work that you did, both Anu and Hayley, thank you so much for those questions and the thoughtfulness. And I also want to just thank you for the work that you're doing in our community to support kids. And it's just so important to us at FOLD, and we've been trying to find ways to make things happen. And the closer we get with events like this, I just feel really excited. We were going to have Adam a while back, and now we finally have done it here. And so we're really excited that this all came together. If you want a copy of FIRESONG, which of course you do, or if you want to get it for classrooms and that sort of thing, you can actually go to Another Story Bookshop, which is our partner, and get a copy, free shipping, plus fun things like masks and buttons and stickers and stuff. But I also want to mention that CBC GEM has FIRESONG the film on there as well. And so you can go on and watch the film and do the book and do a comparison and a chat. And so there's lots of great ways to interact with this story for young adults. And so this is a special shout out for teachers who are watching this now or who will watch this on playback. There's lots that can be done, and we're going to be sharing some resources, including this conversation, to help you do that more. So thank you, Adam, Hayley, Anu.
I'm just going to interrupt. Sorry, I think
No.
also Anik Press, the publisher, has an educational guide on the website that you can download for free, as well as a companion to the book and the film and all of that.
Perfect. I think what we'll try to do when we post this video as well is put some of those links underneath so that when people are coming to this conversation, they can find those different things as well. So thanks for mentioning that.
Excellent.
Awesome. Okay, well, that marks the very last event for FOLD Kids Bookfest 2020. I can't think of a better way to wrap up this season and this weekend. I just want to say a special shout out to my team, especially to Amanda and Ardo, who've been working on this really hard for the last few months, and we'll finally get to sleep tonight, maybe. But thank you to those of you who participated in any event, and those of you who are watching this on playback as well. We appreciate the way that you are finding us, following us, listening, and we hope that you'll do that more. You can find us at FOLD Kids on Twitter, on Facebook, and on Instagram. On Facebook, we get really cool and clever, and it's FOLD Kids with a Z instead of an S. But otherwise, it's pretty easy to find us. My name is JL Richardson. It's been a pleasure being with you tonight and throughout the course of this weekend. Have a great one.